How does beauty work in shaping our brains, the spaces we inhabit, and the communities that we build? These questions were the focus of the second plenary session of our International Symposium on Beauty at Work that we held in Washington, D.C. in May 2023. I'm going to share this discussion with you over the next couple of episodes. The session featured a conversation between four panelists: Dr. Anjan Chatterjee from the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Julio Bermudez from the Catholic University of America, Dr. Sherry Parks from the University of Maryland, and Pallavi Deen, founder of the design firm Roar in Dubai, UAE. The panel was moderated by Christine Emba from The Atlantic. You can find the link to the video of our discussion in the show notes. I want to thank the sponsors of our symposium: Templeton Religion Trust, the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California, the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame, Archbridge Institute, and the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America.
Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm very excited for this panel, actually. I am a journalist, so I have a lot of questions, and I think I'm going to learn a lot from our panelists. But I'll quickly introduce them, and then we can get into the discussion, because I know we have a lot to talk about. So to my direct left is Dr. Anjan Chatterjee. He's the professor of neurology, psychology, and architecture at the University of Pennsylvania and the director of the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics, where he studies the psychological and biological underpinnings of the aesthetic experience in people, places, and things. And I'll direct you to his excellent book, The Aesthetic Brain, which is a summary of the field of neuroaesthetics. And he's the past president of the International Association of Empirical Aesthetics and the past chair of the Society for Behavioral and Cognitive Neurology. And then to his left is Dr. Julio Bermudez, an architecture professor at CUA, School of Architecture and Planning, where he's directed the Sacred Space and Cultural Studies graduate concentration since 2010. He also co-founded the Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality Forum in 2007, which is a 700-plus member and 64 countries, I think at this point, organization. And he has served as its president since 2015. And then Dr. Sherry Parks, who is responsible for the beautiful video that welcomed us this morning. And she's worn a lot of hats in her career. She's the Emerita Professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, and has spent the last decade as a higher education administrator, most recently at the Maryland Institute College of Art, which is a mildly confusing name, but she can explain that. And she now leads community-based funded social justice projects like the one you just saw now. And she's currently the program director of the National Dye Initiative, a community and economic development project focused on indigo. And then, last but certainly not least, Pallavi Deen plays at the intersection of design and entrepreneurship. So she founded her design firm, Roar, in 2013. She's a trained architect and sustainability specialist and has won multiple awards for work across a range of sectors, including the commercial, hospitality, and residential. She's a former professor of design and strives to implement the latest theoretical and practical research into her firm's designs. And she was named the Architectural Digest Middle East Designer of the Year in 2020 and Designer of the Year globally by Interior Design Magazine in 2021. So this panel is called Beauty at Work. So I'll ask the obvious question here, and maybe we can go down the row so everyone else has a chance to talk a little bit more about their work. So we'll start with you, Anjan. How does beauty interact with your work?
Beauty interacts with our work in a couple of ways. One that is common to many of the scientists in the audience, which is that it serves as a motivator, along with curiosity, as a motivator for how and why we do our work. There's another sense in which beauty is actually the object of our inquiry, which we are interested in a basic science question, which is what is the nature of human aesthetic experiences, of which beauty is one of the most salient ones. So what is beauty is a basic science question. How does the experience of beauty vary, which makes it a cultural question? And why does beauty matter? And that becomes an application or a translational question. So we're interested in all of those. And as you mentioned, one way to organize our thinking is the way the brain carves out the world into people, places, and things. And so we're interested in how beauty works in each of those. And just to point out, in Sherry's video, you get a good example of that, where there are elements of the beauty of people, of the environment, and things in the context of these human artifacts, which we call art, which was an important part of that video.
Julio, talk to us. How does beauty interact with your work in architecture in the built environment?
Well, I'm a professor and a researcher, so there are two parts that I look at beauty. As a teacher of architecture, beauty is in a way a centerpiece of my teaching. And this is a little bit controversial, not so much in CUA, but another school of architecture in which beauty has been for most of the 20th century, certainly from the 50s on, a non-discussable issue, because there were some other more important issues to address, such as, development of humanities, after the Second World War, social growth and change and so on and so forth. So therefore, functionality, technology, and things of that kind begin to take over the discipline, with some understanding. However, a beauty, regardless of what people said, most architects still consider it, even back then, as an important thing that they were not supposed to talk about, but everybody wanted to produce beautiful buildings. Of course, we have the tradition of pre-modernity that is in the West and in other part of the world that have evolved a sense of beauty. Classical language, Gothics in the West, for instance, that we could refer to as examples of how humanity have evolved a particular way of engaging the built environment in ways that are pleasing and appealing to perception and experience. But of course, modernity has its own particular way about it. So a big question for me as a teacher is how you bring that up in the classroom and how you somehow produce pedagogies that articulate both conceptually but also experientially, intuitively, because of course, as we all know, beauty is not found in the intellect. You could articulate it, but in reality, there is a direct experience. Or at least I would argue that. So there is that whole conversation that we could have on how you do that. And as an investigator, I'm very intrigued about beauty as a profound, sublime, extraordinary experience that transforms us. One that certainly is not judgmental, one that is certainly, as I said, transformative, in which we succumb to the other in ways that we are not myself anymore. We become in this profound relationship. Plato said that we fall in love when we find beautiful. So I'm very intrigued about that and how you begin not only to understand what that is, or how that happened, how the phenomenology of that impossible event in which the physical architecture, the environment, can produce arguably the most metaphysical of the responses, connecting with God. We know, for instance, that sacred spaces, regardless of culture, regardless of time, over and over and over again, have used beautiful buildings as a way to attract people and convey their religion and spiritual understanding. So in this investigation of beauty, for me, I use empirical tools to begin to gauge the immeasurable. So I'm trying to measure the immeasurable in the hope of, like now, I'm trying to express the inexpressible, the ineffable by using words. So it's an impossible task, but it's a task that I think for first time in this 21st century, we are able to at least begin to look at things that nobody else before us could do. So it's kind of exciting time in that way.
Indeed. So at 9 a.m. in the morning, we are going to measure the ineffable. So just get ready for that, audience. Sherry, can you tell us a little bit about how beauty interacts with your work? In particular, can you tell us about the video that we just saw and how that works for you?
Okay. So my academic area, my research area is ordinary aesthetics, or what people do in their day-to-day lives to bring meaning and beauty and interest into their lives. So that makes the art and other artifacts a meaning structure. So it's how people talk to each other, how families talk to each other, how communities talk to each other without talking to each other. And that makes art and art-like things. I use the word aesthetics, which is not just art. I'll use them interchangeably today, if you'll allow me, if my colleagues will allow me, because that's sloppy, but it's quick. It makes it an extremely important tool for social justice. So there are things that people, regardless of culture, do all over the world. You know, they eat, they have sex, they make art everywhere. And so there are things that art does. I think of art as having muscle. I mean, what can it do? I mean, we often think of art as it's nice. Brandon, the drug dealers of Baltimore know what you found, that if you plant flowers, they move. They understand the aesthetic of despair. And so you just keep planting flowers until, you know, they're gone, which I find fascinating. Well, I'm very interested in the way art moves in people's lives and how they use it or receive it in meaning making. So what you saw was part of an NEH-funded project around narrative in Baltimore. It came out of the Baltimore Uprising in 2015. And these are kids in a very much underserved community. And we asked them we didn't say it this way because they're kids, but what is the utopia Baltimore? And I didn't ask them about homeless shelters. The level of empathy that they said, there are people worse off than we are. And they began to build the best homeless shelter in the world. And the squirrel, the part I have to explain, they were brilliant because they don't, well, now they do actually, but when this was built, they had very little green space. I like to think that the urban planners sent it to the city, listened, and they actually did. They said, you know, we refer back to those paintings, but they said, if we have a squirrel, you have to have a tree. And that means you probably have a grass. And so the squirrel became code for an ecosystem of parkland. And that's why both painters you saw in the dreamscape, the squirrel was huge and they fall out laughing. And what the counselor makes clear in this video is that they wouldn't have thought those thoughts if I just walked in and said, what do you want to happen in Baltimore? I mean, they would have looked at me. But the painters made it different. The painters inspired them. And I learned that day that it matters when your ideas come back to you in oil. Both painters were using what the kids called real art. And they were honored because the painters came back ready to change. And they said, no, this is perfect. You got what we said. And it was deeply meaningful to them. And those paintings are in that building now. They hang on permanent, semi-permanent. I check them now and then to make sure they're still there. And that's the way art works. The idea, there's this concept called organizational aesthetics. That's often used in marketing, but it can be used in much. We know that the art brings up what we'll call unconscious. Excuse me, John, I know that's an overly simplistic term. We know that both in the artist, but also in the person who is perceiving the art, that it can pull up things that would not have otherwise been pulled up. That's enormously powerful. And so I think it's really important that I think it's irresponsible to teach people to be artists without teaching them the power of their art. Because then they're just kind of willy-nilly. They're people with guns who don't know how to use them. But also the ethics of using them responsibly. So I'm deep in the weeds in that way. By training, I am an ethnographer. So I've spent time in people's homes and mapped how they are using things. And I tell my students the simple way to do it is to follow the dog. The dog will take you to the hearth place and just sit there for 2 hours. And they think it's the lamest assignment in the world until they do it. And I first asked them to take photographs of this room. And families won't let them do it because that room is always untidy. Because it's where you put your feet up. It's where you eat, you do things like that. And then they just map what they see and how the family moves around it and what that means for what's called the family mythology, the meaning structure of the family. So that's a very simple way of what I do, but then we turn it around and use it for social justice, which is what we're doing.
That's incredible. I love that.
Thank you.
An interesting note about the squirrel in this story, actually, these layers of representation and meaning. I learned recently, and Julio, you can probably tell me if this is correct, that squirrels are non-native to a lot of American cities and were introduced in like the 1800s as a way to teach urban youths boys especially, how to be kind. that they would fall in love with these little small animals and that would make them sort of better humans. So it's objects, it's art, it's the representation of what the object means. And Pallavi, I mean, you work in design, so I think you probably have a lot of familiarity with, these objects, but also sort of their place in the home and the office space. How does beauty interact with your work?
Wow, I think it's integral to my work, right? In many ways, I think I sell beauty every day. Through 5 years of architecture school, one of the big questions was form or function. Everyone's heard this before, right? And obviously, as a 17-year-old young, naive student, I was like, obviously, both. As a good architect, it's going to be evidence-based at its core. It's going to be functional, but it's going to be poetry. Now, 20 years of practice, I believe they're mutually exclusive, right? I don't think you can have form and function both. And the reason I say that is, was it last year? Yes, last year we unveiled the Museum of the Future in Dubai, right? That's where I live and work. And it is a stunning piece of architecture. Some people say it's the most iconic, beautiful building in the world. And I'm very proud that it's Dubai. It was delayed. It's this gorgeous stainless steel piece of, art, which has got Arabic calligraphy on it, 77 meters high. But the project was delayed. It was extremely expensive. It was a structural nightmare. So is that functional or is that just form? And it really makes me question most of what I do on a daily basis. I can't have both. I can either make something poetic and just to express myself or to express a client's vision, or I can actually make it functional. And, they might meet somewhere in the middle, like 60-40, 70-30, but for something to be truly beautiful, that has to be the pursuit. And I know I'm sitting on a panel with academics and they're going to quote you science journals and whatnot. So let me bring it to mainstream. I was watching the movie Air. Anyone's watched the movie Air recently? And, when Sonny, one of the guys, goes to the shoe designer and he says to him, design me the latest, greatest shoe. And he asks him the question, form or function. And, the shoe designer says to him, listen, poetry gives meaning to life, but engineering got us to the moon. So you kind of, you can pursue beauty, you can pursue art, but somewhere you kind of have to ground yourself. And I think for me in my work, it's always that battle, bringing myself to reality, letting myself go. So yeah, that's kind of where my work sits.
That is also fascinating. I mean, I think we'll go back to Anjan for the next question here, because thinking about where beauty grounds itself, I mean, we observe it, we take it in via the eyes and the mind. Can you tell us a little bit about the actual scientific implications of this? Like, what does beauty look like in the brain? How do we sort of carve it out and assign value to it, maybe?
So listening to this conversation, I'm struck by, I've been going back to reading about the Romantics, particularly the German and English Romantics in the late 18th century, and the way in which they were reacting to the age of enlightenment. And all of these issues of what's kind of desiccated functional science and the way in which we respond to beauty in the world of feeling, were issues that they were dealing with. And I'm finding it quite fascinating that 225 years ago, that these same issues that we are all struggling with were so germane. So going back to your question, for us, the issue is always beauty of what? That kind of beauty as an abstraction ends up not giving us much purchase. So if you talk about beauty of faces or beauty of places or beauty of art, the nature of the questions can vary. So to a first approximation, as I mentioned, our visual system carves out the world into people, places, and things. There are parts of our occipital cortex that are tuned to faces. There are parts that are tuned to environments and the built environment, including the built environment. And there are parts that are tuned to object. There are parts tuned to visual motion. Beauty in a face, again, as to a first approximation, is when you have simultaneous neural activity within parts of the brain that are specific to processing faces and our reward systems. So these are in the deep structures of the front of the brain. They have fancy names like things like the nucleus accumbens or prefrontal cortex. But it's when there's a simultaneous activity of a domain-specific area, which could be faces or places. It could be the auditory cortex for music, and a domain general part of the brain, which processes rewards and pleasures. And so that simultaneous activity is at least a biologic description of what the experience of beauty is. Now, if you introduce expertise, so you have architects looking at beautiful buildings in a way that they might look at it differently than people without that kind of expertise, you still have that same pattern, but you have other parts of the brain coming into to bear on the response. And that often has to do with parts of the brain that are oriented towards knowledge and memory. And so this can be demonstrated using imaging experiments where you have people with design expertise or architects and lay people, and you can see these kinds of differences. So generally, there's a kind of domain-specific response and then a domain-general one. And then the other point I would make that we've been very interested in is that while our brain is very good at discriminating objects, right? So we have, most people can tell the difference between faces pretty quickly, but we're not very good. Our brains are quite promiscuous when it comes to values. And so the idea that goodness and truth and beauty tend to be conflated in the brain. And this raises certain kinds of questions. And we've been interested as an ancillary in the question of the shadowy side of beauty. Is there a seduction to beauty that can lead us astray?
The seduction part is something that I think we'll return to a little bit later. But I'm interested in this idea of measuring beauty, actually. We so often talk about beauty as though it's, yes, the ineffable, that there's no way to really pin it down. But Julio, you've also talked about this a little bit, the idea of a beautiful building or a beautiful place. What is a beautiful building? Like, is there an empirical way that we can say, this is objectively beautiful, this isn't? And what does that look like in the field? Do we still believe that?
Well, these days, politically correct, people say that everything is constructed. So there is no way to produce an universal anything, which I disagree. I think we are Homo sapiens, going back with some of the ancients. We are constructed a certain way. We walk upright. Doors of perceptions are certain and not others, and the brain operates a certain way than others. Of course, culture, personal upbringing, expertise, all that stuff enters the consciousness. I think the question of unconscious, or better said, the non-conscious, is basically what we are all somewhat the commonality about it, right? There are certain things that we tend to perceive, like proportion, scale, materiality, textures, proportions, harmony, height of buildings, sound. Those things conform what I would call the envelope or the environmental dimension of architecture. And those things, if produced in coherent, in harmonic ways, will invite particular reaction of humanity. Now, of course, after that, there is all this much more conscious aspect that highlight, the text. The way I would think, imagine you have a page, an old text, and then you begin to highlight it, right? You have an beginning impression of the composition of that page, and then your eye goes to what is highlighted. But the first thing is the whole page. And there is a lot of that happening in this unconscious aspect of it. We're trying to test this right now with our eye tracking mobile work supported by Templeton. Exactly this question, this precognitive, if such thing exists, the thing that comes just before I even am aware. And then what happens, I am aware. Well, now that I have this perception, what is I pay attention to? And there is some hypothesis about that. There is a lot in the building that, going back to what you're saying, I think beauty is based on sacrifice. People had to put time and effort and money into a building for the building to begin to have this presence. I don't think you get nothing for nothing. I mean, when you go to these ancient buildings or even contemporary buildings, I'm thinking buildings that are very controversial, like the Oculus by Calatrava in New York, that people have all kind of issues because it went, too expensive. It's about shopping, blah, blah, blah. But if you go to the building and you go with an open mind, it's the best cathedral for the ordinary person that 21st century had created. And I would just make that case right now. So that is a big sacrifice that somebody did for 200, 300,000 persons a day that cross that amazing thing. And I think we sense that. We sense that in our bones, in our heart, and we sense it not just individually, but collectively. So anyway, so there are ways to measure these things, and I can speak more. I'm sure that Anjan can do it better than I can, but there are ways in which we begin to be able to measure. We are far from, especially out of the lab, to do these things, but at least we begin to point out, for instance, how the default mode network is interrupted or is profoundly disrupted, which is because attention is called by the beautiful. The beautiful, we cannot remain aloof. It called for attention, and there suddenly the whole brain go from this wandering to focus. And suddenly the ordinary way of operation changes dramatically. That's something very easy to measure, actually, even by rudimentary EEGs. Anyway, I stop there.
I mean, we're going to come back to that because that contains so much. But actually, I'm going to jump to Pallavi very quickly for this one. One of the things I noticed in this conversation is, or at least what you were saying is, we talk about the cathedral, sort of the classical buildings, but that's a very Western building style. And Pallavi is our only international participant on this panel right now. So I wonder, are there shared threads in the understanding of what beauty looks like that cross cultures that you've seen, or what has that looked like for you? I know we were actually talking about fashion as we were sitting up in the front row just this morning.
Let me ask you a question, right? How many of you in the room, and just a show of hands, have reacted to a human, to nature, to object and gone, that's beautiful? Okay. So we're in a very diverse setting right here, right? But like Giulio said, we're all just Homo sapiens. We're humans. When we see something that's calling to us, we all react. I love what you said about walking into a cathedral. Now, that could be a mosque, that could be a synagogue, that could be a temple. And the reason why we react as humans is the scale. Anjan and I were just talking about how beautiful the ceiling is, right? Okay, would I ever design something like this? No, because I'm a very contemporary architect, but I can appreciate it. And why am I appreciating it? For a couple of reasons. Everything that Giulio has just touched on: balance, symmetry. You look at Islamic geometry, it's so intricate, like it's so rich. But at the same time, I can also appreciate a brutalist building, which has very clean lines, which is, or a modernist building, which is just devoid of any ornamentation, right? Because it follows those principles of balance, symmetry, harmony. And we can harp on about this because that's what we do. But one of the things that I want to kind of bring here, and you talked about fashion and things like that. For me, beauty is tangible. Okay. So we do a lot of work in the metaverse, in the NFT space, right? But it's never really taken off. And I kept asking myself, why is that? Because the metaverse or Web 3.0, whatever it is, it's not immersive yet. What do I mean by that? It does not engage our five senses in the way that sitting in this room is engaging at least four of my senses. I mean, okay, there's water, which is kind of tantalizing the taste buds. But my point is that for me, and this is personal, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, right? Beauty has to be tangible to have that visceral kind of reaction, which is why I feel happiest when I'm walking down Central Park or, when I'm looking at the dunes or the deserts, right? Because I can touch it. But with a metaverse space or with NFTs, it's just, it's just an image. Like, what's that? But anyways.
That's a great point. I am personally very suspicious of the metaverse, in that I think it's actually created to deaden us in some ways, to remove us from the tangible and take us to a place where we don't have to think about how the world, yeah, exactly. It may just be sort of crumbling around us, but it's art put to that nefarious and in my ideal purpose. And so, Sherry, I actually want to turn to you for this question. And also, panelists, we should just feel free to jump in on this conversation. Just give me a wave.
I wanted to say, and not to take this away from you, Anjan has research on exactly this thing, on the aesthetic experience and what it means. So can I yield my time a little to him?
I will, but I'm going to ask one question first, and then maybe you should both take it.
I want to hear your answer before I respond.
Well, my question for you, Sherry, and I think this maybe both of you can talk about this, is art is tangible. Art makes us feel things. But in your work with social justice, in your work with art and communities, is it used to make us feel things to sort of distract us from the circumstance? Can art be used sort of as the opiate of the masses to quiet people down, or does it actually awaken us? And what's the difference? Can you use art differently in both of those ways?
Oh, very, very much so. I mean, that's been written about a lot of art's ability to be healing. And there are people here who are doing trauma-informed practice. And so it can be healing, quote, it can be a balm for the wounded soul. That's what got African Americans through slavery and Jim Crow, foodways and spirituality and art. And it can do that. It can actually do both at the same time, because it can help you to imagine and to practice situations that are dangerous in any other way. I mean, we saw women in the Middle East during the Spring Uprising where they couldn't meet in person, but they could meet online, Second Life, which, do you remember that? And it allowed them to think through things, to practice things in ways. So what's wonderful about art is that it can do all of the above. It can do all of the above at the same time. And so we can't separate it. We do, because we dissect things. That's what we do. But when we look at the lived experience, people are doing all of those things at the same time.
So Anjan, now we're going to throw it back to you.
So the way we tend to carve out the space is something referred to as the aesthetic triad, which is that there are sensory motor qualities of the experience. There's the emotional experience itself, and the way in which meaning and semantics plays into this. And so you can take each of those in turn, and, to underscore what Pallavi said, which is the sensory experience is absolutely critical to many of these kinds of aesthetic experiences. There are occasional exceptions, and we heard a little bit about this last night, which is the beauty in mathematics, which is very much of a conceptual beauty. And it's not obvious how sensory systems really play into this. But for most of us, sensations are absolutely critical to beauty. And that has a link directly to emotions. And as Julio said, this happens very quickly. The first response to beauty can happen within 250 milliseconds. And then there's a later wave that happens about a second and a half. And what's happening in those two different epochs might be quite different. But there's an immediate response. And what we find is that within visual cortex, within our sensory organs in the brain, that valuation is occurring. So you could imagine a design of the brain that says the back of the brain carves out the world into objects of different kinds, and the front of the brain imposes value. But we find that all the way in early processing, value is already embedded in it. And so the way in which sensations and value are really tied together in the brain is quite extraordinary as far as that goes. And when it comes to the meaning, one of, Julio has talked about the ineffable. And we've been very interested in this, of how do you measure the ineffable and what is the ineffable? And part of the question around ineffability is knowing what is effable. And that brings us to language. And this is where the cognitive parts comes in. So we have, again, like this conference and Julio's work, we do have a project funded by the Templeton Religion Trust, which is trying to have a taxonomy of vocabulary to identify what impact art or beauty or aesthetic experiences have, to really lay out a vocabulary, because until you have a nuanced way of describing these experiences, you don't really get to the ineffable until you've exhausted what is actually effable, at least is our take on this.